Imagine waking up and not knowing where you are. Not the ordinary confusion of waking in an unfamiliar room. Something deeper than that. Something that reaches into the most fundamental processes of your mind and scrambles them. The walls are breathing. The colors are wrong. The face of the man across the room is melting and reforming and melting again. You do not know how you got here. You do not know what has been put into your body. You do not know, in the most literal sense, what is real. Now imagine that behind the mirror on the wall, men in suits are watching you, taking notes, sipping coffee, discussing your psychological deterioration as a data point. This happened not in a science fiction story, not in the imagination of a paranoid novelist, not as a metaphor for anything. It happened in a safe house on Telegraph Hill in San Francisco, in a hotel near the Presidio, in New York City, in various locations across the continental United States over a period of years in the 1950s and 1960s. The men doing the watching worked for the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. The people they were watching had, in most cases, no idea that they were being observed, no idea that they had been drugged, and no idea that what was happening to them was part of a government program with a name that sounds like something out of a fever dream. Operation Midnight Climax. It was a subset of a larger program called MKUltra. Both names are real, both programs were real. The documents that prove it exist in the National Archives, available to anyone with the patience to read through thousands of pages of government records, because the records that survived, and not all of them did because many were deliberately destroyed, tell a story so strange and so disturbing that it has never quite found the place in the public consciousness that it deserves. This is an attempt to put it there. To understand Operation Midnight Climax, you have to understand the world in which it was conceived. The early 1950s were not a time of American complacency. They were a time of profound, sometimes paralyzing anxiety about the threat posed by the Soviet Union and by international communism more broadly. The Korean War had just ended in a stalemate that felt, to many Americans, like something between a failure and a defeat. The Soviets had detonated their first nuclear weapon in 1949, shattering the American monopoly on atomic power. China had fallen to Mao's Communist Party the same year, and then there were the prisoners. The prisoners of war who came back from Korea were the immediate catalyst for what followed. Some of them had, while in captivity, made statements and signed documents that seemed to support their captors' positions. Some had appeared in propaganda films. Some had apparently voluntarily provided information to their interrogators that they should not have provided. And when these men returned to the United States, many of them could not fully account for their behavior. Some of them seemed genuinely not to remember certain things. Some of them exhibited psychological states that were consistent with severe trauma, but also to the intelligence community analyzing these cases with something else. The phrase that entered the American vocabulary in this period was brainwashing. It came from a journalist named Edward Hunter, who used it to describe what he believed the Chinese and Soviets were doing to prisoners of war, some form of psychological manipulation so powerful that it could rewrite a person's beliefs, override their training, compel them to act against their own values and interests. The word was alarming, it was meant to be, and it reached the highest levels of the American intelligence establishment, where it was taken with a seriousness that, in retrospect, seems both understandable given the anxieties of the time and deeply, consequentially misguided. The CIA's response to the perceived threat of Soviet brainwashing was to try to develop its own version. If the Soviets could do this to American soldiers, the thinking went, then America needed to understand how they were doing it, needed to develop defenses against it, and perhaps needed to develop offensive capabilities of its own. The result was a research program that began in 1950 under the name Project Artichoke, was preceded by an even earlier project called Project Bluebird, and eventually expanded and consolidated into what became known as MKUltra. MKUltra was authorized by CIA Director Allen Dulles in April 1953. It was not authorized through any normal governmental process. It was not reviewed by Congress. It was not subject to any of the oversight mechanisms that theoretically governed how the American government spent its citizens' money and deployed its resources. It was a covert program funded through mechanisms specifically designed to evade congressional scrutiny, operated by people who understood that what they were doing could not survive public exposure. The program's technical director was a man named Sidney Gottlieb. He was, by any measure, a remarkable person. He had a PhD in biochemistry from the California Institute of Technology. He had a stutter that he had worked for years to overcome. He kept a Christmas tree farm in Virginia and made his own yogurt and practiced folk dancing. He was, by accounts of people who knew him, genuinely likable in person, warm, intellectually curious, committed to his work. He was also the person most directly responsible for authorizing and overseeing experiments that, by any reasonable ethical standard, constituted serious crimes against the people subjected to them. Gottlieb believed, and he was not alone in this belief within the CIA of the 1950s, that chemical substances might provide the key to unlocking the mechanisms of human psychological control. If you could find a drug that reliably disoriented a person's sense of reality, that broke down their normal psychological defenses, that made them susceptible to suggestion or confession or behavior they would not otherwise engage in, then you might have a tool of incalculable intelligence value. A truth serum, a weapon against resistance, a mechanism for the kind of psychological intervention that the brainwashing hypothesis suggested the Soviets were already deploying. LSD had been synthesized by a Swiss chemist named Albert Hofmann in 1938, and its psychedelic properties had been accidentally discovered by Hofmann himself in 1943 when he absorbed a small quantity through his skin while working in his laboratory. His account of the experience, the strange visual distortions, the altered sense of time, the profound disruption of ordinary consciousness, had been circulating in scientific and intelligence circles for years by the time the CIA became interested. The CIA's interest in LSD was intense and immediate. Here was a substance that, in minute quantities measured in micrograms, quantities so small that they were essentially invisible to the naked eye, could completely overwhelm a person's ordinary sense of reality. It was far more powerful than any other known psychoactive substance. It was colorless and odorless and tasteless and could be dissolved in water or dropped onto a sugar cube or mixed into a drink without the recipient knowing, and its effects were so dramatic, so all-consuming, that they seemed to obliterate a person's capacity for normal self-protective thought. To Gottlieb and his colleagues, LSD looked like the key they had been searching for. MKUltra eventually involved more than 150 separate research projects conducted through universities and hospitals and research institutions across the United States and Canada, many of which did not know they were working for the CIA. The funding flowed through front organizations and foundations with innocuous names. The researchers who received the money were sometimes aware they were doing classified government work and sometimes were not. The human subjects were almost always unaware of what was being done to them and why. But within MKUltra, there was a particular program, a specific operational application of the research, rather than pure experimentation, that pushed further than almost anything else in the broader project, Operation Midnight Climax. The name itself deserves attention. It has a specific meaning, and that meaning is not coincidental. The operation used prostitutes as unwitting instruments. Sex workers recruited and managed by a CIA officer named George White, who operated under the cover name Morgan Hall, would bring clients to safe houses that had been specially prepared for the purpose. The clients, men who had come for sex, who had no idea they were being recruited as test subjects for a government intelligence program, would be given drinks that had been spiked with LSD by White and his associates. And then, from behind the one-way mirrors that had been installed specifically for the purpose, CIA officers and their associates would observe what happened. The primary safe house in San Francisco was a rented apartment at 225 Chestnut Street on Telegraph Hill, established in 1955. It was decorated deliberately to look like the kind of place that an artistically inclined young woman might live. There was a bar, there was furniture chosen to suggest a certain bohemian lifestyle, there was art on the walls. It looked like a home. It did not look like a laboratory. The one-way mirror through which the observers watched was concealed. George White was not a subtle man. He was a large, hard-drinking, former Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who had spent his career in the rougher precincts of law enforcement. He had a fondness for alcohol that was, even by the standards of a hard-drinking era, notable. His diaries, which surfaced years later, described the operations at the safe houses with a casualness that is itself disturbing. Matter-of-fact accounts of drugging people and watching their reactions, interspersed with accounts of his own drinking and personal activities, as if what he was doing was simply part of a normal working day. In some sense, for him, it was the prostitutes who worked with White, who brought men to the safe houses, who administered the drugged drinks under White's direction, who were themselves not always fully informed about what they were participating in, were paid for their services and for their cooperation. They were also, in some cases, subjected to the same drugs they were administering. The ethical landscape of the operation was, from top to bottom, a landscape of exploitation and deception. The men who were drugged at the safe houses experienced varying reactions. LSD's effects are not entirely predictable. They depend on dosage, on the psychological state of the person taking it, on the setting, on whether the person knows what they have taken and has any framework for interpreting the experience. A person who takes LSD knowingly, who has been prepared for the experience, who is in a comfortable and safe environment with people they trust, will have a different experience than a person who has no idea what has happened to them, who finds themselves in a strange room with their perceptions radically altered and no explanation for it. The men in the CIA's safe houses were in the worst possible conditions for receiving a psychedelic drug. They were unprepared, they were deceived, they did not know what had been put into their drinks, and whatever they experienced, the visual distortions, the dissolution of normal temporal awareness, the extreme emotional intensification that LSD produces, the blurring of boundaries between self and environment, they experienced without any context, without any support, without any of the psychological scaffolding that might have helped them navigate it. Some of them panicked, some of them became deeply frightened, some of them exhibited behavior that, in the notes of the observers behind the mirror, was described in clinical language that is difficult to read now without a particular kind of revulsion, because behind the clinical language, there is a human being in genuine distress who does not know what is happening to them. And the people watching are not helping them. They are watching, taking notes, assessing whether the substance is achieving the desired effect. Frank Olson was not drugged at the safe houses, but his story is inseparable from Operation Midnight Climax and from MKUltra more broadly, because his death became the moment when the program's consequences for real human beings became impossible to deny, even for those within the CIA who most wanted to look away. Olson was a biochemist who worked for the U.S. Army, assigned to the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. He was involved in classified research on biological and chemical agents. He was, by accounts of people who knew him, a decent man, a husband, a father of 3, someone who had begun to have serious doubts about the work he was doing and the things he had seen in the course of that work. In November 1953, Olson attended a work retreat at a rural property in Maryland. At the retreat, he was given Cointreau that had been spiked with LSD by Sidney Gottlieb. He was not told. He was told afterward, when the effects became apparent, that he had taken the drug, but by that point the experience had already begun and the damage was already being done. Olson had a severe psychological reaction. He became deeply anxious and depressed. The experience seems to have destabilized something in him that was already fragile. A person who was already grappling with serious questions about his work, already struggling with what he had seen and done, who was then subjected to an experience that would have been profoundly disorienting under any circumstances, and that, in his specific psychological state, was devastating. In the days and weeks that followed, Olson's mental state deteriorated significantly. He was taken to New York to see a physician who was associated with CIA-connected research. He was apparently scheduled to return to Maryland and possibly to be hospitalized. Instead, in the early morning hours of November 28, 1953, Frank Olson fell from the window of his room at the Statler Hotel in New York City. He fell 13 floors to his death. The official account was suicide. His family was told he had fallen from the window during a disturbed episode. His family was not told that he had been secretly dosed with LSD 10 days earlier. They were not told that his mental breakdown had been triggered by an unauthorized government experiment conducted on him without his consent. They were not told any of this because the CIA needed them not to know, because the truth of how Frank Olson came to be in that hotel room, in that mental state on that night, was a truth that the agency could not afford to have known. Frank Olson's family would spend decades trying to find out what had actually happened to him. When MKUltra was partially exposed in the 1970s, when the Church Committee hearings brought some of the program's activities into the public record, when Olson's family finally learned the basic outlines of what had been done to their husband and father, the response of the American government was to apologize and to pay a financial settlement. President Gerald Ford personally apologized to Alice Olson and her children. It was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, of a kind. It was also, of course, a very carefully bounded acknowledgement. The settlement paid to the Olson family came with an agreement not to pursue further legal action. The specific details of what had happened to Frank Olson, the full circumstances of his breakdown, the full nature of the government's knowledge of those circumstances, the question of exactly how he came to fall from that window, remained, in certain respects, unclear. The Olson family never accepted the official account. Eric Olson, Frank's son, spent much of his adult life investigating his father's death. In 1994, the family had Frank Olson's body exhumed for forensic examination. The forensic pathologist who conducted the examination, James Starrs, a professor at George Washington University, found evidence he believed was inconsistent with the account of a man who had simply fallen or jumped from a window. He found injuries to the skull that he believed had been inflicted before the fall. He concluded that Frank Olson had not committed suicide but had been murdered. The CIA denied this. The official position remained that Olsen's death was a suicide. The investigation that followed the body's exhumation did not result in any criminal charges. The case was closed, officially without resolution. The question of what happened in room 1018A of the Statler Hotel on the night of November 27th to 28th, 1953, remains open. What is not in question is the sequence of events that brought Frank Olsen to that room. He was a government employee who was secretly drugged by his own colleagues as part of a classified experiment. He suffered a severe psychological breakdown as a result. He was dead 10 days later. Whatever the precise circumstances of his death, whether it was suicide, as the government maintained, or murder, as the family's forensic evidence suggested, the chain of causation from the LSD dosing to his death is unbroken. Sidney Gottlieb, when Olsen died, went to Olsen's office at Fort Detrick and personally removed files. He did not report this to the FBI. He did not preserve the evidence. He managed the aftermath as he managed everything else in MKUltra, by controlling the flow of information, by ensuring that what could not be defended would not be known. MKUltra itself ran for more than a decade until 1973. By that point, the political environment had changed dramatically. The Senate investigations into intelligence community abuses, the Church Committee, named for its chairman, Senator Frank Church of Idaho, were beginning to look at what the CIA had been doing during the Cold War years with an unprecedented level of scrutiny. The Watergate scandal had already demonstrated that the executive branch was capable of profound abuses of power, and the appetite for further revelations had not been satisfied. CIA Director Richard Helms, in 1973, ordered the destruction of MKUltra files. This was not a small act. The program had generated thousands of documents, research reports, financial records, operational logs, correspondence between Gottlieb and the various contractors and institutions conducting research on the CIA's behalf. The destruction of those files was a deliberate effort to prevent history from having access to the full record of what had been done. It was not entirely successful. A cache of files survived, not because anyone deliberately preserved them, but because they had been misfiled in a financial records storage facility that was not covered by Helms's destruction order. These files were discovered in 1977 during a Freedom of Information Act search, and their discovery prompted the Senate hearings that brought MKUltra into public knowledge for the first time. What the surviving files revealed was extensive and disturbing, but it was also, by necessity, incomplete. The files that survived were largely financial records and administrative correspondence. The most detailed records of what had actually happened in the experiments, what had been done, to whom, what the effects had been, what the researchers had observed and concluded, those were among the records that had been destroyed. The full picture of what MKUltra encompassed and what it produced will never be reconstructible from the documentary record, because the documentary record was intentionally reduced to an incomplete state. The Senate hearings of 1977 were remarkable events. They featured testimony from Sidney Gottlieb himself, who was by that point retired and living quietly in rural Virginia. Gottlieb testified under oath, but his testimony was carefully bounded. He confirmed certain facts about the program. He denied others. He invoked privilege where he could. He was a man who had spent his career managing information, and he managed his Senate testimony with the same professionalism he had brought to everything else. He expressed in those hearings something that might be interpreted as regret. He described himself as a patriot who had done what he believed was necessary for the security of his country. He described MKUltra as a product of its time, of the extraordinary fears and uncertainties of the early Cold War, of a genuine belief that the Soviet threat was existential, and that extraordinary measures were therefore justified. These explanations are not entirely without merit as historical context. They do not, however, constitute a defense. The people who were drugged in the CIA's safe houses had not agreed to serve their country in that way. The men who came to a room on Telegraph Hill looking for a normal human encounter had not signed up to be research subjects. Frank Olson had not consented to the experiment that destroyed his psychological equilibrium and preceded his death by 10 days. The logic of necessity. The argument that the ends justified the means, that the threat was so great that ordinary ethical constraints had to be suspended, is an argument that has been made by people doing terrible things throughout history. It has never been a sound argument. It is made more unsound, not less, when the people making it are specifically targeting the powerless, the unwitting, and the uninformed, rather than accepting any of the risk themselves. The people in the CIA who authorized and oversaw MKUltra and Operation Midnight Climax were not themselves subjected to LSD without their knowledge. They were not the ones watching their reality dissolve in a room they had not agreed to be in. They were behind the mirror, safe, in control, taking notes. The architecture of one-way glass is a useful metaphor for what happened in these programs more broadly. On one side, people who did not know they were being observed, who did not know what was happening to them, who had no power over their situation. On the other side, people with authority and resources and the legal and institutional protection of a powerful government agency, watching, assessing, conducting their research from a position of complete safety. This asymmetry, the radical imbalance between those with power and those without it, in a context where power was being used to violate rather than to protect, is not unique to Operation Midnight Climax. But the program's specific architecture, the literal one-way mirror, makes it visible in an unusually direct way. The safe house operations in San Francisco were not the only location where Operation Midnight Climax was active. George White established a second facility in New York City in a Greenwich Village apartment that operated under similar conditions. The New York operation began slightly before San Francisco in 1952 and 1953 and provided what White and his CIA handlers described as a more urban, more anonymous testing environment. The New York safe house was decorated like the San Francisco one to suggest a specific kind of person lived there. The target subjects were different in New York, less focused on men who came for paid sex, more varied in their backgrounds. The operational details varied. The fundamental structure was the same. People were brought to a location they thought they understood. They were given drinks or food that had been adulterated with LSD, and they were observed by people they could not see. White kept meticulous personal diaries throughout this period. Not the kind of diaries that were required by the CIA's operational protocols. Those records were eventually destroyed. Personal diaries in which he wrote about his experiences running the safe house operations with a frankness that would be remarkable in any context and is almost surreal in this one. He wrote about the subject's reactions to the drug. He wrote about his own drinking, which was considerable. He wrote about what he found professionally satisfying about the work and what he found merely tedious. He wrote with the matter-of-fact ease of a man who did not believe he was doing anything that required concealment or justification, at least not in the private record he was keeping for himself. When those diaries eventually became part of the historical record, when they were discovered and made available to researchers years after his death in 1975, they provided a window into the psychological state of someone who was doing things that most people would consider monstrous, who was doing them with apparent equanimity, who had constructed for himself a professional identity in which dosing unwitting civilians with powerful psychedelic drugs and watching their reactions through one-way mirrors was simply a job, a government job, a patriotic job. White's most famous written reflection on this period came in a letter he wrote to Sidney Gottlieb after retiring. It is worth dwelling on because it encapsulates something important about the psychological state of the people running these operations. He wrote that he had been a very minor missionary, actually a heretic, but he had worshipped at the same altar as his colleagues, and that was good enough for him. He said that he toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun. Fun. And where else, he asked, could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? It reads like dark humor. It reads like a man enjoying his own outrageousness. But it also reads like a man who, on some level, was being honest about what he believed his job had licensed him to do. The phrase deserves to be read slowly. Lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage, with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest. This was not a man who had lost his moral compass and was anguished about it. This was a man who had decided his moral compass was irrelevant because he had institutional sanction. The CIA, in White's accounting, was the All-Highest, the authority that superseded ordinary ethical constraints and gave license for actions that would otherwise be crimes. This is the logic that MKUltra operated on, not the logic of necessity alone, though that was part of the justification. The logic of institutional authority, the belief that if the CIA says it is permissible, if the Director of Central Intelligence authorizes it, if the program is classified and therefore exists outside the normal framework of law and ethics, then the normal framework of law and ethics does not apply. The research that MKUltra generated was, as a matter of practical intelligence utility, largely a failure. The hypothesis that had animated the program, that drugs like LSD could be used to break down resistance, extract information, or rewrite psychological states in controlled and predictable ways, turned out to be wrong. LSD is not a truth serum. It does not make people cooperative. It does not make them susceptible to suggestion in the way the CIA had hoped. It makes them confused and frightened and dissociated from their normal psychological processes, which is not the same thing as making them useful intelligence sources. This failure was not because the researchers were careless or unsophisticated. It was because the hypothesis was wrong. The Soviet brainwashing threat that had animated the entire program was, in significant part, a misreading of the evidence. The Korean War prisoners who had signed confessions and appeared in propaganda films had not done so primarily because of sophisticated psychological techniques. They had done so because they were hungry, exhausted, frightened, and subjected to the ordinary pressures of captivity. The brainwashing hypothesis had attributed to exotic psychological technology what was actually the product of simple physical coercion. The CIA spent more than a decade and an enormous amount of money and violated the rights and well-being of an unknown number of American civilians in pursuit of a technology that did not exist for the purpose they had imagined it. They destroyed evidence that might have allowed a fuller accounting of what they had done. And when the program was finally exposed, the response of the institution was, characteristically, to manage the disclosure as carefully as possible, to apologize in the most bounded terms that could be negotiated, and to ensure that the specific individuals most responsible for the program's worst abuses faced no meaningful personal accountability. Gottlieb, to his credit or to his discredit, depending on how you weight various moral considerations, did not simply deny what he had done. He acknowledged it, he contextualized it, he defended it as a product of its time and circumstances, and then he went back to his farm and his yogurt and his folk dancing, and he lived another quarter century without ever facing a jury. The Church Committee hearings of 1975 and 1977 produced extensive documentation of MKUltra and its subprograms. Senator Edward Kennedy, who chaired the relevant subcommittee, was visibly shaken by some of what the testimony revealed. He described what he heard as a chilling indictment of the CIA's disregard for the rights and welfare of American citizens. The language was strong. The institutional response to that language was considerably more muted. The reforms that followed the Church Committee were real, not illusory. The creation of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees, the establishment of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the executive orders limiting certain types of covert action. These changes represented a genuine strengthening of the oversight mechanisms that had been so thoroughly absent during the MKUltra years. They were imperfect, they have been tested and strained in the decades since they were implemented, but they were real. What did not change was the fundamental culture of an intelligence community that operated on the assumption that its activities were too sensitive to be subject to normal democratic accountability. The reforms created new oversight mechanisms, they did not create a new culture, and culture in large institutions is more durable than any set of rules. The people who were most directly harmed by Operation Midnight Climax, the men who were drugged in the safe houses, the sex workers who were recruited and sometimes also drugged, the various others who encountered MKUltra-related activities in hospitals and prisons and psychiatric facilities across the country, received almost nothing. A small number of them, or their estates, received legal settlements in lawsuits that the government settled without admitting liability. The vast majority received nothing, in part because they did not know what had happened to them, and in part because the destruction of records made it impossible to identify who had been subjected to what. The Canadian victims of a related MKUltra program, conducted by a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron at McGill University's Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, received a settlement from the Canadian government in 1992 and from the CIA in 1988 and 1994. Cameron's program, which included techniques such as prolonged drug-induced sleep, electroconvulsive therapy administered at rates far exceeding any recognized clinical protocol, and the repeated playback of recorded messages intended to alter patients' psychological states, was conducted on patients who had come to Cameron for treatment of various psychiatric conditions. They had not come to be experimented upon, they had come to be helped. Cameron's program destroyed the lives of a number of them, leaving them with severe memory impairment and psychological damage that persisted for the rest of their lives. The CIA funded Cameron's work through a front foundation when the connection was eventually established and when the surviving victims and their families sought accountability. The legal process was long, expensive, and ultimately produced settlements rather than verdicts. The institutional lesson that conducting human experiments on unwitting subjects does not lead to personal criminal accountability for those who authorize and oversee the experiments was consistent with the lesson delivered by every other aspect of the MKUltra reckoning. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves attention because it speaks to questions that remain live and contested. The question of what the CIA knew, what it did not know, and what it chose not to find out about the effects of its programs on the people subjected to them is not fully answered by the documents that survived. There are things that should be in the record and are not because the record was destroyed. There are questions that the surviving documents raise but do not answer. And there are questions that have been raised by the families of people like Frank Olson that the official record flatly contradicts, but that the physical evidence, the forensic examination of Olson's body, the injuries that the pathologist described as inconsistent with a simple fall, does not definitively resolve. The one-way mirror in the safe house on Telegraph Hill is gone. The building still stands. The room where men were secretly drugged is now, in all likelihood, someone's ordinary apartment. The people who were in that room on those nights are old, if they are still alive. They may not know, even now, that what happened to them was not a dream or a breakdown or something that came from inside themselves. They may have spent decades carrying the memory of an experience they could not explain, that they could not account for, that they could never fully describe to anyone because they could not understand it themselves. The lasting significance of MKUltra and its subsidiary programs is not only historical. The program ended, but the questions it raised have not been answered. The question of what a democratic government is permitted to do in the name of national security has not been permanently resolved. The oversight mechanisms that were strengthened after the Church Committee revelations, the intelligence oversight committees, the requirements for presidential findings, the various laws and executive orders that nominally govern covert operations, these mechanisms have been tested repeatedly in the decades since the 1970s with results that are not uniformly reassuring. There is one final dimension of this story that deserves attention, because it speaks to questions that remain live and contested. The question of what the CIA knew, what it did not know, and what it chose not to find out about the effects of its programs on the people subjected to them is not fully answered by the documents that survived. There are things that should be in the record and are not because the record was destroyed. There are questions that the surviving documents raise but do not answer. And there are questions that have been raised by the families of people like Frank Olson that the official record flatly contradicts, but that the physical evidence, the forensic examination of Olson's body, the injuries that the pathologist described as inconsistent with a simple fall, does not definitively resolve. The one-way mirror in the safe house on Telegraph Hill is gone. The building still stands. The room where men were secretly drugged is now, in all likelihood, someone's ordinary apartment. The people who were in that room on those nights are old, if they are still alive. They may not know, even now, that what happened to them was not a dream or a breakdown or something that came from inside themselves. They may have spent decades carrying the memory of an experience they could not explain, that they could not account for, that they could never fully describe to anyone because they could not understand it themselves. The lasting significance of MKUltra and its subsidiary programs is not only historical. The program ended, but the questions it raised have not been answered. The question of what a democratic government is permitted to do in the name of national security has not been permanently resolved. The oversight mechanisms that were strengthened after the Church Committee revelations, the intelligence oversight committees, the requirements for presidential findings, the various laws and executive orders that nominally govern covert operations, these mechanisms have been tested repeatedly in the decades since the 1970s with results that are not uniformly reassuring. The people who were harmed by Operation Midnight Climax received, for the most part, nothing. The men who were drugged in the safe houses were never identified, never told what had happened to them, never compensated. The sex workers who participated in the operations received no acknowledgement. The institutions that were used as unwitting conduits for CIA research received belated disclosures that in most cases came decades too late to be meaningful. What did come was knowledge. Incomplete, delayed, filtered through the destruction of records that should never have been destroyed, but knowledge nonetheless. The MKUltra documents that survived tell us enough to know what happened, enough to understand the scale of what was done, enough to be clear about the ethical violations that were committed and who committed them. Sidney Gottlieb died in 1999 at the age of 80. He had spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity, working in medical facilities in rural areas, making yogurt, practicing his folk dancing. He never faced criminal prosecution for anything he had done in the course of MKUltra. He died in a warm bed in Virginia, while the people whose lives he had disrupted or ended in the service of Cold War research had no comparable comfort. In 2001, a journalist named Stephen Kinzer published a biography of Sidney Gottlieb titled Poisoner in Chief. It is one of the most thorough accounts available of what Gottlieb did and who he was. Kinzer does not paint Gottlieb as a monster in the simple sense. He paints him as something more troubling, a man of genuine intelligence and personal warmth who committed what Kinzer describes as crimes against humanity, and who was able to do so because the institutional context in which he operated provided neither constraint nor consequence. What did come was knowledge. Incomplete, delayed, filtered through the destruction of records that should never have been destroyed, but knowledge nonetheless. The MKUltra documents that survived tell us enough to know what happened, enough to understand the scale of what was done, enough to be clear about the ethical violations that were committed and who committed them. Sidney Gottlieb died in 1999 at the age of 80. He had spent the last years of his life in relative obscurity, working in medical facilities in rural areas, making yogurt, practicing his folk dancing. He never faced criminal prosecution for anything he had done in the course of MKUltra. He died in a warm bed in Virginia, while the people whose lives he had disrupted or ended in the service of Cold War research had no comparable comfort. In 2001, a journalist named Stephen Kinzer published a biography of Sidney Gottlieb titled Poisoner in Chief. It is one of the most thorough accounts available of what Gottlieb did and who he was. Kinzer does not paint Gottlieb as a monster in the simple sense. He paints him as something more troubling, a man of genuine intelligence and personal warmth who committed what Kinzer describes as crimes against humanity, and who was able to do so because the institutional context in which he operated provided neither constraint nor consequence. That institutional context, the CIA of the 1950s and 60s, operating in the specific atmosphere of Cold War anxiety with access to unlimited classified funding and essentially no external oversight, was not a permanent condition. It was a historical moment, and it passed. But the elements that created it, the concentration of power, the absence of oversight, the willingness to suspend ethical constraints in the name of necessity, the protection afforded to those within powerful institutions who do wrong, those elements are not safely historical. They are tendencies that exist in any sufficiently powerful and sufficiently unaccountable institution, in any era. The one-way mirror in the safe house on Telegraph Hill is gone. The building still stands. The room where men were secretly drugged is now, in all likelihood, someone's ordinary apartment. The people who were in that room on those nights are old, if they are still alive. They may not know, even now, that what happened to them was not a dream or a breakdown or something that came from inside themselves. They may have spent decades carrying the memory of an experience they could not explain, that they could not account for, that they could never fully describe to anyone because they could not understand it themselves. They were in a room. A man who came at the invitation of a woman they had met bought them a drink. And then the world changed in ways that should not have been possible. And behind the mirror, a government employee took notes, and somewhere in a file in Langley, Virginia, the experience was recorded as data. Not a person, data. That is what Operation Midnight Climax was at its most fundamental. The reduction of human beings to data points in a research program that they had not agreed to participate in, conducted by people who had decided that their research objectives were more important than the humanity of the people they were studying. The mirror is gone, but the question it embodied is still with us. Who is watching? Who has decided, for reasons we are not permitted to know, that what is on our side of the glass matters less than what is on theirs? And when we look at the reflection, what are we actually seeing?